Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're really delighted to have you be present for this. I think we're all in for a real treat. We have an amazing team presenting for us today. I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the Residents and Researchers talk for today, co-sponsored and organized by the M-LEEaD Center's Community Engagement Core and the Integrated Health Sciences Core for the Center. My name is Amy Schultz, and I am co-lead for the Community Engagement Core, and I'm just so delighted to introduce our speakers for today's session. I'm going to begin by introducing Kenyatta Campbell. Kenyatta is the Chief Executive Officer for the Cody Rouge Community Action Alliance. She was recognized by Wayne County Commissioner Alicia Bell as Woman of the Year for Detroit District 6 in 2010, and she was awarded the Mayor's Safe Schools, Safe Communities Heroes Award in 2012. Welcome, Kenyatta. Our second panelist for today is Barb Matney. Barb is the president of the Warrendale Community Organization and co-founder of the In Memory of Community Garden, creating safe and beautiful spaces for communities as well as safe as local and sustainable food for the Warrendale neighborhood in Detroit. Our third panelist is Professor Joan Nassauer. She's professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability here at the University of Michigan, where she leads the Landscape Ecology Perception and Design Laboratory, developing, designing proposals to improve ecosystem services. She's recognized as Distinguished Scholar by the International Association of Landscape Ecology and Distinguished Practitioner of Landscape Ecology by the US IALE. And our fourth panelist is Natalie Sampson. Dr. Sampson is Associate Professor in the College of Education, Health, and Human Services at the University of Michigan, and I'll brag a little bit, an alum and adjunct professor in our own Department of Health Behavior and Health Education at the School of Public Health. Dr. Sampson is chair-elect of the American Public Health Association Environment Section and co-founder of the Environmental Health Research to Action Youth Academy in Dearborn. We're very privileged today to hear about some work that this team, in conjunction with others, have been working on for a number of years. The title of their talk today is Neighborhood Greening for Stormwater Management, What Matters to Residents. So Joan, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm very happy to be here with my colleagues to tell you about this work. The project that we've all worked on together is one that we dubbed New GI. It's about green infrastructure and neighborhood, environment, and water. And what we want to focus on today is what matters to residents. We did this work with the support of the Herb Family Foundation and the U of M Water Center and our very substantial collaboration from the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department and the City of Detroit. The premise of the work was to examine how vacant properties in the city might be employed as part of green stormwater infrastructure to improve downstream water quality, like the Rouge River that you see on the upper left of the screen. We did this by selecting 4 sites in the Warrendale neighborhood of the Cody Rouge district, where the Detroit Land Bank Authority owned vacant property. And using our designs that I'll explain in a minute, the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department with their contractor Tetra Tech transformed these properties into bioretention gardens. What I want to emphasize here is that the purpose of these gardens is to improve downstream water quality, but thinking about the theme of last week's talk and response to localized flooding, we hoped that these kinds of interventions also could reduce localized flooding, like you see in Warrendale here in the photo in the upper right. Next slide. The way we did this work over a period, let's go to the next slide. Yes, the way we did this work over a period of really, it's been nearly 10 years that since we began working on the project, was by involving scholars from many disciplines and 3 universities, which you see on the left, leaders in agencies in the city of Detroit and the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, which you see on the right, and very, very importantly, leaders in community organizations who are here on the panel with us today, Barb Matney from the Warrendale Community Organization and Kenyetta Campbell from the Cody Rouge Community Action Alliance. This is the only way that we can accomplish the kind of work we want to achieve. Next slide. So in brief summary again, the premise was to take 2 adjacent vacant properties, and what we did was to take 2 adjacent vacant properties owned by the Detroit Land Bank Authority when that demolition had occurred, to construct those properties using the type of design you see on the upper right, to construct what we call the bioretention garden, which replaced the basement hole with permeable construction material that could absorb stormwater. But on the surface, as you see on the lower right, transform that into a garden that would be an amenity for the neighborhood and that would discourage dumping on any kind of vacant property. That's why the bollards are there. Next slide. You can see Tetra Tech's design for these bioretention gardens below grade in the typical section view. Importantly, what's happening with stormwater there and what could relieve local flooding is that water is coming from the street where water runs from people's yards and their driveways and their rooftops, ultimately into the street. It's taking that from the street, putting it in this hole that's been filled with a permeable material that's called the bioretention garden. These can hold up to almost 300,000 gallons of water. That's a lot. None of them actually over the course of our project were ever got that full, but very high capacity. Importantly, for the neighbors and for residents, on the surface, they are intended to look like gardens, but gardens where you don't go in and walk around, but you enjoy from the sidewalk and the street, because inside they're all business. They're all about trying to hold stormwater and keep the surface open to absorb stormwater. Next slide. So I wanted to set this up because this is what Barb Matney experienced in her home in Warrendale just last month in August. And it shows the need for green infrastructure to manage stormwater. Barb, will you explain what you experienced here?
I mean, I guess I can start with back in 2014, our basement flooded. We had 3.5 feet of sewerage in our basement. So a year later, when I was introduced with these bioretention gardens, I was all in because I knew that something had to happen. So last year we put in a park here in Warrendale, in Aquit Lock Park, and I knew that it was really important to educate. So what we did is we installed a rain garden. So this is what you're looking at. This was actually the August 27th rain event that we had. And as you can see, the flooding is halfway to the pavilion. And what we did is we have gutters on the pavilion and then the tube underground that feeds the rain garden. So, I mean, you could see it took in as much water as it could. The education part for the neighborhoods are what's really important. We have to let them understand that anything that we can do is going to help, even if it's something this small. It's not to the extent as the big bioretentions, but there are things that we can do at a community level. And then the next picture actually shows literally 24 hours later and the water is gone. The rain garden did exactly what it was supposed to.
Let's see the next slide. There we go.
So yeah, so it did. If you look down in there, you'll be able to see there's just very little water because your rain gardens are made, that within 48 hours, the water's gone. So, I mean, we're really excited about it, even educating everyone in the community, even at this level, that even with rain gardens, we can help and we can do our part.
Thanks, Barb. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide helps us understand how important it is to implement actions like the rain garden that Barb showed, and the much higher capacity bioretention gardens that were the focus of our project. It's even more important in Detroit than in some other cities, just because of the geological history of Detroit, which makes the city very, very flat. And we all know water runs downhill. So if you're in a flat place, water isn't going to run very far and things aren't going to dry off naturally very easily. So, and the reason for that, I find this really interesting, is that during the last glaciation, so 12,000 years ago, Detroit was essentially at the bottom of the edge of a massive lake. And that's why Detroit soils are largely clay and Detroit is so flat. So if you look at green infrastructure in other cities and other parts of the world and see something you like or that they say is working well, pause and realize that what works well in other places may not work in the same way in Detroit because it's flat and because the soils are largely clay. So the opportunities are different in Detroit, and we need to think differently about how we prevent localized flooding and clean stormwater. Next slide. So part of what we've done in the new GI project is think not only at the scale of rain gardens, very small interventions, or bioretention gardens on 2 adjacent vacant properties, which are much, much larger and larger capacity. We've thought even larger than that, looking for places like you see in this publication, which you can download from the website later if you want. This is an area, a low area in the Brightmoor neighborhood near Fankel. That has many, many vacant properties. And so we've looked at that in a speculative project, not built, to show how much larger amenity areas could be constructed in the city, especially where you have some slopes like you do in Brightmoor and vacant properties, to collect stormwater in a way that begins to mimic the wetlands that were part of Detroit in the past, but also would create recreational amenities. So we need to think systematically about how all of these things can go together to make Detroit neighborhoods even more desirable places to live in ways that also manage stormwater. Next slide. So looking at the bioretention gardens, we interviewed 2 years after they were constructed in 2015. We attempted to interview, and Natalie had a very key leadership role in this interview process. We attempted to interview every household within 800 feet of the 4 pilot sites. And in the end, we interviewed 171 households in these in-depth interviews. Next slide. What I want to focus on here, first I want to tell you a bit about the respondents, who were 87% African American, about 70% women, about half the people had household incomes below $27,000 a year. And I think really importantly, half the people were owners of their homes, and more than a third at that time, and this was before some of our big storm events like this last year, had experienced flooding in their home in the past year. We report on this in detail in this publication that I show on this slide if you want to look at it later. Next slide. Another key finding of this survey is we asked people, well, who should take care of the green infrastructure in the neighborhood? First of all, we learned that a third of the people who we interviewed were already taking care of vacant properties, not their own, in the neighborhood. So bearing that additional responsibility. More than 2/3 thought that taking care of green infrastructure for stormwater management should be the responsibility of the city or DWSD, the agency. Next. So keeping that in mind, and we had already really learned that maintenance was going to be an issue by working with our advisory committee prior to the survey, we developed alternatives for the bioretention gardens we had built to help us think about maintenance from the residents' perspective. And so we showed not only what you see in the upper left, the existing bioretention gardens in their neighborhoods, we showed them with less and less elements, fewer and fewer, that would require less management, until finally, if you look at the green box on the lower row, where really the only maintenance that would be required for those bioretention gardens was mowing, the simplest form of maintenance. We wanted to see really what mattered and what could be maintained. And then we looked at how that compared with a controlled vacant lot, or a vacant lot that had all these plantings that we'd prescribed, but had gotten too weedy. Let's go forward, because we'll see how it looks now with bollards, same idea. So you can see these were some of the many visualizations we used in the survey. Next slide. So what did we learn from the 171 household respondents who live near the bioretention gardens? If you look at the spider diagram on the left and look at the top axis on the spider diagram, you'll see that what was far and away most preferred by residents for a vacant lot near their home was what we built, the bioretention gardens with bollards, not the berms, with the bollards in front. And that other most preferred options going down that axis, maybe I can, anyway, the axis at the top, also included flowering plants or shrubs. A little bit less attractive to most people were alternatives that included trees that were added on the site. People had concerns about maintenance with those trees and also about sight lines. If you look at the gray lines in the spider diagram, you see how people responded to either a weedy, unmaintained lot with all the great plantings, but it just wasn't maintained, or a plain vacant lot. And you see that those were by far the least preferred, and they gave much lower ratings on attractiveness, perceived safety, whether this would encourage you to walk in your neighborhood, whether it would encourage you to interact with your neighbors, whether it might positively impact mental or emotional health, and even impact on your own investment in the home where you lived. So on the one hand, the results tell us, the bioretention gardens we built that have a lot of flowers and shrubs are really appreciated. But on the other hand, if you look at the closeness of these ratings on the Likert scales on attractiveness, perceived safety, impact on neighborhood walking, and so on, you see that Moan is kind of a salmon color there, that the salmon alternative, which is mowing only, also rates much higher, significantly higher than an ordinary treatment of vacant lots, particularly if there were bollards in front to discourage mowing. So this gives us some room to move on maintenance, that even a very low maintenance alternative with a functioning bioretention garden and bollards was rated by residents as giving a lot of benefits that they would appreciate. On the other hand, making even greater investment in a site that looks more garden-like with low-growing shrubs and flowers was far and away the most preferred by residents for near their house. Next slide. And I want to tell everyone who is listening to the webinar that we're going to end with this slide and a few more comments by the other panelists, in the hopes that you'll have questions and comments so that we can really spend more time with questions and comments. But as Kenyetta, Barb, Natalie, and I have talked over what we've learned so far, here are the priorities we identified as emerging from our experiences with the project, and very much what residents have learned and recommend from their experience so far. That a top priority, no surprise, in September of 2021 is to prevent household flooding. And I want to emphasize here that the federal law that provokes the green infrastructure that you see being built in Detroit and other cities is really aimed at improving downstream water quality. It isn't really aimed at preventing localized flooding. So those additional benefits have to be built in for other reasons and may cost more to build. And it's something for us to keep in mind, for example, as federal infrastructure money is becoming available to cities. So preventing household flooding was the first priority. And the way that this might be achieved in Detroit is going to look different because of the flat landscape and clay soils that do not readily infiltrate rain in the way that bioretention gardens can. Second priority is enhanced neighborhood appearance. Residents, we learned, want the green infrastructure benefits that help their neighborhood look well maintained and safe. Everyone enjoys walking in a more beautiful, safe looking place. But this leads to the third priority. You can only do that if you can ensure that green infrastructure will be maintained. And what we learned from our project overall is across the United States, cities are still playing catch up with rearranging responsibilities for maintenance among city agencies so that green infrastructure that might be built primarily to manage stormwater is maintained in a way that might be more consistent with, say, what the Parks Department or the Public Works Department usually does. So there needs to be some rethinking to ensure maintenance. And last of all, especially related to localized flooding, focus on familiarizing residents with what they can do and support them in doing it. That means things like keeping the existing storm drains open. We know that the mayor and the director of DWSD spoke about that last week as a priority. Help residents understand how they can keep stormwater flowing away from their homes, like Barb showed in the park site that they have built. And above all, keep whatever green stormwater infrastructure you have from being clogged or contaminated or compacted. These are sensitive systems, and you don't build them and walk away. You build them and maintain them. Let's keep this slide up there. I do want to say that we have one more slide that maybe we can show at the end that shows where you can download all of the publications from our shared project, New GI. They're all free, and we developed them for you to use. With that, I'm wondering if Kenyetta or Barb or Natalie might want to add some thoughts or expand on some of what we've said so far.
I wanted to first, thanks a lot, Joan. I wanted to respond first to one of the questions that's in the chat. The question was, what are you doing to involve schools and education of the next generation? I want to say kudos to the team that when this project initially started, there was engagement with Dixon Elementary School, well, middle school at the time. And a lot of those students are actually in college now, first year time in college. So it's great to see that they were able to have an impact and understanding and learning about different careers as it relates to green infrastructure in the communities. I do believe that this project did provide attractiveness to the community when it was first installed. A lot of times residents fear walking past vacant lots that has, overgrown trees and grass. So these projects actually provided, a sense of attractiveness to the neighborhood, which then also provided safety as kids are traveling back and forth to school. And in these particular areas, students are actually, it's a high traffic area of students traveling back and forth to school. So I believe that these projects provided that sense as well. And then last but not least, a lot of times, residents are looking to figure out ways on how they can increase their property value. And when you have, vacant lots that are, that are just not maintained, that brings property value down for properties in the neighborhood. So that is something as a community that we are, looking to continue to figure out ways, how do we continue to address that. But I want to definitely give kudos to Barb, who we consider as like our the hero of Cody Rouge as it relates to understanding these topics and, you know, taking the time out of her busy schedule to make sure that she's addressing. So Barb, kudos to you for all the hard work you've done on behalf of the residents in Warrendale.
Thank you. You know, I think a lot of it, Kenyatta, came when I flooded, right? So when I drive around and I see all these issues and I see the devastation on these families' faces, I understand it because I went through it myself, you know, and you know it too. We are out there to help the community and to help people. And that's what you and I are doing. We're doing everything that we can to make sure that all this stuff happens. So I appreciate you also.
I'll chime in. I'm yes, grateful to all of the team. And I have learned so much from Barb and Kenyatta. Barb about the technical aspects, who is now definitely an expert in this green infrastructure. I just want to emphasize too, you know, I think that Joan alluded to this, and throughout our project, especially as flooding has been on folks' minds, you know, this isn't a cure-all, and this isn't, you know, going to counter the decades of disinvestment that some neighborhoods have felt in terms of infrastructure. So again, just, I think for me, it was helpful to learn from our team of engineers and community partners and everybody involved in thinking about, you know, Joan's knowledge of landscape architecture, you know, that there is a lot we could consider when designing these sites. And so while it's driven for water quality, why not use this opportunity to address health and equity issues? And why not use this opportunity to look at that disinvestment and address, you know, structural inequities within the city? And so I think that just really stepping back, and I mean, and hopefully if you look through those reports, there's a lot of evidence of how, you know, what matters to folks, the name of the title of today's talk. And I think it's so important to think about this maintenance issue. And I don't think we can stress it enough of, you know, building that into the process, but also looking to, you know, who's managing those vacant lots, who's, you know, the role of landlords, and in that supporting residents, are we able to take those infrastructure dollars to those flooded communities and prioritize them, right? In terms of, you know, some of these gardens can be done on a budget, but some of these other interventions for flooding can be really expensive. And so there's things we can all be doing, but there's definitely some things we all need a little help with. So just kind of highlighting some of the things Joan mentioned on this last slide, but looks like there's a lot of questions coming in through the chat. So I'll stop there and see what we can chat about.
You know, one thing I want to add briefly, Natalie, is that because Detroit has vacant property distributed widely through the city, there really are solutions that could be engineered that would occupy more of that vacant property with functioning green infrastructure if it's adequately maintained. So I think that from the standpoint of relieving local flooding, I would like to emphasize that we should be optimistic that there are solutions that can widely improve conditions with localized flooding and also build amenity throughout the city. We really should we should have that vision in mind.
Thank you to this team for a really engaging and thoughtful presentation. News to me that the investments in flooding infrastructure really are not intended to reduce local flooding, but they're really focused on downstream. That's important information to have as we continue to think about this challenge. We have a question in the chat that I'll let you guys decide who would like to take this one. The question is, have you looked at how some countries internationally have dealt with flooding? For example, Holland, the Netherlands.
I can say that in my lab, we definitely have. And it relates a bit to what I said about the geologic history of Detroit and the fact that Detroit is a coastal city, but on the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes are behaving with climate change differently from the way ocean coasts are. The Great Lakes levels go up and down, but not in the same way at all that oceans do. So for example, we can learn some things from the Netherlands, but only some things. In addition, Detroit has this opportunity to rethink what's going to happen with that vacant land that many cities don't have. So we can learn from other places, and we need to keep looking at what's happening with nature-based solutions, in particular in Europe and the UK. And at the same time, I think we can initiate some really original, authentic, local solutions here in Detroit.
Thank you, Joan. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? Okay. Lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to move us on. There's a question here about whether this team has been able to further explore why residents are willing to take care of vacant properties that are not their own. And a second question, is this something that's unique to the communities of study? Barb, did you want to take that?
I was going to say, I can probably take that. My husband and I, for many, many years, we used to wake up in the morning and just go, okay, let's go clean something. And we would just take off and go clean a lot somewhere that needed some assistance. Okay, so a lot of that has to do with safety and cleanliness. So what we've realized over the last 20 some years of doing this kind of stuff is that if the area is clean, it gives you the impression that it's safer. And 9 times out of 10, it is safer because people would rather walk outside, ride their bikes. Kids would want to play in an area that's clean. So taking on and cleaning these lots that people don't own, it's all about creating cleanliness and safety within your neighborhood. So, and I know that there's a lot of people across the city of Detroit that do that. They automatically take on and clean a lot next to them. Because if you don't, I mean, then you're causing tall weeds and grass, which also harbors rodents. So it all kind of works together.
Thank you, Barb. We have another question that's actually also for you, Barb. You may have answered this in the chat, but I'm going to lift it up anyways. In regard to the photo of the flooded rain garden, was there educational outreach about the time that it takes for a rain garden to work, or how has that affected community perceptions of their effectiveness in the absence of relatively instant results?
Well, I mean, we did educate as we were doing it. We went ahead and opened up the community to be able to come and help actually make it, dig it out, put the right soil in, plant all the plants. And in the process, we had Rain Gardens to the Rescue there that helped, and they have put in signage. So it actually explains all about the rain garden, what's planted in it. And then what I do, and I didn't realize that so many people will walk over and look at the signage that's there. But when I do notice people over there and they're curious about the space, even the children, I'll walk over and talk to them, because they might still have questions that aren't necessarily on the sign. So, I mean, it's really important to make sure that they understand that it's not only pretty, that it actually has a purpose.
Great. Thanks, Barb. And that is a local resource then, the Rain Gardens to the Rescue is a local organization that helps with that. Great, thank you. All right, we have a question about what it all cost. Joan, this one might come to you. What was the budget for the project, and are there funding sources available for neighborhoods interested in replicating the rain garden? Barb, that might be for you. Yeah, so where do you get the money to do this?
So I think it's good to separate questions about bioretention gardens or stormwater wetlands from questions about rainwater gardens. Because the scale is vastly different and the effect over time is going to be vastly different. So it's good to think of them quite separately. Related to elements of stormwater management that we can count on to operate over time in an important way to manage stormwater, reduce localized flooding, that kind of funding can come from agencies and from, again, from state and federal infrastructure support, which we're getting more of right now. So we should think of it that way. the bioretention gardens that we built that DWSD built in 2015, one of their reports thereafter put the cost at, let me just say over $100,000 per garden, somewhat over. And so these are not inexpensive investments. So that's why it's important that they be very effective.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to those of you who are continuing to chime in the chat with additional resources and thoughts. We have a few minutes. If there are any additional questions, while folks gather their thoughts, I have a question for Natalie. And Natalie, I know that the process of collecting some of the survey data ended up being a very interesting and process that required a little bit of innovation on your part in terms of the interviewers. And I just wanted to invite you to see if you wanted to talk at all about the process of gathering some of that survey data that's contributed so much to thinking about the rain gardens, and flooding overall.
Sure. Yeah. And I hope that folks go to some of these reports and find those, there's a lot more findings that we weren't able to talk about from the surveys that, are representing what people really think about these sites. And so we were able to go back a few years after they were in the ground, not all to the same people. I think, Amy, maybe some of what you're alluding to is just the changing neighborhood. People come, people go, with a lot of the vacancies too. We weren't always speaking to the same folks. It was really important to us to make sure that we understood what, everything from what safety meant and what it in perceptions of those preferences. I think it's so important when, Joan's talking about some of these issues. A lot of us who aren't landscape architects, and, we think, oh, greening equals good or trees equal good. And so, to have that nuance, and it might look very different in different neighborhoods, but part of this was working with Kenyetta and Barb to identify folks who people were comfortable opening the door to and talking about these sites with. And so it was definitely not an easy task, as anyone who's done some survey research knows. And also just trying to be respectful that, a lot of folks are over surveyed. And so helping to provide resources and signage and to show, as Barb has said time and time again, to kind of help people see what these gardens are all about at the end of the day. So, at the beginning of the project, as Kenyatta mentioned, the kids were involved, but also going door to door in those close households to see and say, hey, this is something that might be coming to your neighborhood, and having some of those conversations that aren't necessarily part of research, but just, being there and having those conversations being really important from the outset. So yes, lots of great information related to health, related to safety, related to preferences. Hopefully people are listening and hearing about all the work that residents are doing, that caring and that maintenance. That's people's time, that's money. And I think that that's part of the infrastructure. And so as we're having these conversations, there's a lot of good stuff that came from those surveys. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Natalie. I wonder if any of you have thoughts about the potential for Detroit Water and Sewerage to take this sort of prototype that you developed and had really good success with and expand it. Joan, you were talking about the potential to do that throughout the city. Is there anything in motion that would help other neighborhoods experience some of the benefits that have accrued from this project?
So among the things I'm optimistic about, Amy, is that there is federal funding with the American Recovery Plan Act, as well as potential infrastructure money coming down the line that will enable the city of Detroit and Detroit Water and Sewage Department to think even bigger about how to not only achieve cleaner downstream water quality, which the Clean Water Act requires, but to provide other kinds of responses to localized flooding. So I think we're entering a period of great innovation. People understand that climate change and all of the ways that it taxes us literally in our lives with flooding and overheating is something that we have to do something about. So I think the resources are there now to think more comprehensively about it. The last thing I'd say is, since we did this project, the Detroit Land Bank Authority, which holds vacant property in Detroit, has now become part of the city. And that also reduces some of the institutional barriers to creative use of vacant land. And so I think there's good momentum for more comprehensive creative solutions.
Thank you, Joan. I have to say, having watched Joan in action with this project, she is a master at bringing together a really diverse group of people needed to conduct a project like this, with engineers and landscape architects and sociologists and survey researchers and people with expertise in the law. It's a wonderful example of what it takes to pull people together with a diverse set of skills and make change happen.
So can I just say that in the course of doing this work, Amy, what I've learned from you and Natalie and others in the School of Public Health has enriched this work enormously. And I think that is, that's just part of the inherent value of doing work that actually we want to implement, because we have to learn from each other and do. So thank you.
All right, I see questions are slowing down in the chat. I want to invite, if anyone has any last minute questions, go ahead and pop them in there, and just invite the members of the panel if you have any parting thoughts. Last, to help us wrap up this really engaging and exciting conversation.
I'd just love to hear Barb say what's next for her garden site, because it continues to grow. And I don't know if she wants visitors popping in, but to share the work she's doing is just amazing.
Yeah, I'd love to have people come. And by the looks of the picture, the way that there was so much water in the rain garden, I am discussing with everyone about extending it. So it definitely needs to be a little bit larger. Now the space that you saw that was blank now has gym equipment in it. So we're definitely going to extend the rain garden. But, I would really like to share with you guys, I was touring the retention areas with Joan a week and a half ago. And I have to say, even though the testing and that kind of equipment is gone out of the sites, we were still able to observe how much water those retention areas actually took in. And you could see on some of the shrubs the force of the water that was coming into these areas. It was just amazing. I guess unless you can actually see it for yourself, you don't realize how important these things are and how great they are for communities, period. I mean, any neighborhoods that flood, I know this is not the be-all solution to flooding problems in neighborhoods, but they definitely do help. So we are very, very blessed to have Warrendale chosen to be the pilot for these amazing retention gardens.
Thank you, Barb. Actually, Barb was reminding me that one thing you guys didn't talk about, and I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about this, but the science that went into actually testing the cleanliness of the water when it went into the retention pool, and then testing how clean it was at the other end when it came out. Joan, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, sure. So our colleagues in environmental engineering, aquatic ecology, and very importantly, DWSD's contractors, Tetra Tech, were all involved in instrumenting each of these 4 pilot sites. And if we go back 2 slides, if we could, to that spider diagram, which can be a bit, it can take a while to really comprehend it, but if we could see the spider diagram, what we would see is that on stormwater quality and quantity, all 4 of the sites performed extremely well. And we were testing my colleague Alan Burton, an aquatic toxicologist, was testing for contaminants that aren't necessarily regulated under the Clean Water Act, but there was urban streets are dirty places, and they create contaminants for stormwater that we don't see necessarily in other places. And the bioretention gardens were very effective in reducing those contaminants, as well as some of the nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, that are of great concern for polluting the rivers downstream. So, and then in addition, I'll just emphasize that the capacity that you can build into these, really think of them as very, very deep puddles covered by a garden, or think of them as a new kind of urban wetland that is a garden. The capacity is enormous there, and it's easy for me to imagine how, as time goes on, and say there's street regrading in the city of Detroit, there always is, there are always street upgrades in any city, there's even greater potential for getting more water from the street, from households, which goes into the street, from the street, into these localized bioretention facilities that really could improve ecosystems and neighborhoods.
Allison, are you able to go back 2 slides and show what Joan was just alluding to?
That would be slides, that one, yes. So if you look at the gray lines, the deep gray line is the bioretention facility that is as if it weren't maintained. And you can see there's a lot of loss of community amenity if it isn't maintained, but even without weeding, and we weren't thinking about removing garbage, that would be important for any of these, but that the stormwater nutrient removal, the peak flow reduction, that is how much water is coming through in a big storm, and the stormwater volume reduction were very, very high, regardless of the design, certainly compared with a vacant lot. And so that's tremendously good news. And really, for the effectiveness of that, I do very much want to credit DWSD's contractor, Tetra Tech, which did all of the detailed engineering design and helped us develop the instrumentation and develop this really effective approach.
Great. Thank you, Joan. I think we're just about at the end of our time. I want to thank this amazing panel one more time for sharing with us this really incredible project. And fingers crossed by all of us that it may become embedded into infrastructure in the city of Detroit. I did have a question, Joan. I think you had maybe some resources on the last slide. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's available on the website for folks who are interested in further information?
Sure, thank you, Amy. So when you go to that website, that is my lab website. One whole section of it is devoted to metropolitan watersheds. There you can see the new GI project. And in addition to the topics that Natalie and I discussed that were in those publications, I'll want to point out another one that was led by our colleague, Margie Dewar in urban planning. And that is a publication that is all about what is working in other legacy cities across the United States. Philadelphia, New Orleans, let's see what some of the Toledo, I think, was one of the other cities. So that you really can look at different types of governance settings in legacy cities, cities that have some vacant land, and learn about how other cities are approaching this. Everyone is learning is part of the lesson here, and how we develop innovations that work in Detroit will help other places.
Thank you so much. And that sounds like a great note to end on. So thanks to this team once again, and also to the support team that helped us make sure that things ran smoothly with slides and all else involved. We thank everybody for joining us and look forward to seeing many of you at future sessions.